Chapter 9. The Cabin on the Ridge. Mac was surprised to find that the 4 healthy hounds could eat nearly as much as 4 men at a meal. "No wonder you're always lugging in provisions," he remarked to Johnny, who had for some time been worrying about the cost and difficulty of feeding them. The cabin was so far from the railroad that Johnny had trouble enough to bring food in for himself, though during the previous autumn he'd secured a quantity of meat from a moose, which hunters had killed solely for its antlers. But the problem was a pressing one. As a ranger in Wharton, he could not shoot game for them. Likewise, he could not expect to take the pack with him on his rounds of the hunters' camps, and in the coming shooting season, for the hounds would likely frighten some of the game, and thus annoy the sportsmen. So it ended with a loan of the black and tans to Mac, who had more spare time and could use them hunting coyotes. "Anyway, Reddy's a whole pack in one, and probably won't leave me now," said Johnny. "He'll be easy to control when he and I are alone and get to know each other better." And so it happened that only Reddy returned with the ranger to the cabin on the ridge. Johnny had left with Mac a report to be sent by train to headquarters about Bill and Mose, and expected to be told to come to town to press charges in person. But by the time the hunting season was in full swing, no word had reached him, and he thought it best not to delay any longer in starting on the trip around his district. He took his camping equipment and the pack horses and began his leisurely journey with Reddy as a companion. Knowing all the principal camping places, he found it easy to locate for hunting parties. He spent the nights at his own camps, and by day he rode around the mountains, always accompanied by the hound. Whenever they approached a camp, Reddy held back and vanished in the bushes, to wait until Johnny took the trail again. The ranger's principal business with the men was to see that those who hunted had licenses and were not killing more than the legal limit. He was on good terms with all the guides and enjoyed the short talks he was able to have with them all. All had heard from Bill and Mose this story of this wild hound that they claimed Johnny had taken from them, and usually it came up for discussion. Johnny thought it was wise to say little. At one of the camps, however, he met an elderly sportsman named Marshall, who was particularly interested in hounds, and to this man he managed to show Reddy. Marshall was deeply interested and asked many questions about him. Johnny eventually told Reddy's history as far as he knew it. On 2 evenings, the sportsman turned up at the ranger's camp to chat further with him and see more of the hound, for whom they seemed to have taken a great liking. When Johnny returned to the cabin, he often thought of Marshall. Snow came in the valleys early that autumn. Johnny always took his vacation after the shooting season ended, but this year he was in a quandary over what to do with Reddy, who was still afraid of every stranger and would never enter a house. He was debating the matter when a band of Indians came to the valley to trap. They made camp about 2 miles from the cabin, putting up teepees as usual and allowing their horses to graze in the valley as best they could with the light snow everywhere. One afternoon the chief and 2 others from the camp paid a call on Johnny, accompanied by a flock of mongrel dogs that they usually had hanging around with them wherever they went. The dogs were half starved, and while the powwow was in full session indoors, began to hunt for food. They found Johnny's storehouse, broke into it, and pulled out a ham, some pieces of pork, and other things that seemed especially edible. Reddy had been some distance away in the woods, but heard the dogs and came bounding back. He saw what was going on, and he charged the vandals and fought the whole crowd of 6 at once. They were fierce, half-wild creatures, but they were easy compared with the wolves that went rolling before his lightning rushes. He had a big fight while it lasted, though. When the Indians came out of the cabin, there was no dogs in sight. They found a number of red stains on the snow and the remains of the half-eaten provisions, but that was all, and they went away very mystified. Johnny made a good guess, but said nothing, and when the coast was clear he called Reddy out of the bushes and gave him more of a petting than he'd ever received before. He saw that he could depend on the hound to defend his property. and while the dogs had managed to do considerable damage, they would have done more had they not been interrupted and punished, and probably they would have come back again and again. One problem was more on Johnny's mind than any other during those first days of snow. He knew that the black wolf would likely come back almost any time now and lure Reddy away, unless somehow he could be brought indoors at night. Now that the black and tans were not in the cabin to keep him company, there was a likelihood that the hound felt lonely. Sometimes at night, when Johnny had gone to bed, he would howl from the top of the big rock in wolf fashion until the coyotes started yapping. On 2 occasions, Johnny heard Timberwolves answer him. Was he calling the king? For a time, Johnny suspected that he went hunting on his own accord, but this proved to be wrong, for as often as the ranger woke up at different hours and called Reddy, he would always come bounding from nearby. Before the winter came to stay, there was a warm spell, several days of heavy rains that melted the snow. Johnny took this opportunity to go to the station with his horses, to leave them with Mac until spring. There would soon be little feed left for them in the valley, and there was always plenty in the lowlands along the railroad. The ranger locked up his cabin in preparation for a night at Mac's castle, and carried his snowshoes in case of deep snow coming suddenly on the heels of the rain. Mac was very glad to see him, and the black and tans gave Reddy a vociferous greeting. So Johnny stretched a point and stayed 2 nights. Instead of snow, clear, crisp, and cold weather came, bringing northern lights that lit up the whole sky on the second night. Strips of white radiated from the north, shimmering slightly, and changing patterns slowly until they almost merged, then split again and gradually thinned and receded. The weirdness of it caused the coyotes to set up a great clamor, and the hounds to howl long and mournfully. In the morning, right after breakfast, Johnny and Reddy left on foot for the return trip. Without much to carry, the ranger could cover ground in this manner faster than with pack horses. He found the path through the woods pleasant to travel now that the mud had partly frozen. Everywhere the wild creatures were busy. Red squirrels ran ahead, jays called. An old black porcupine, followed by a half-grown young one, was eating bark from a pine. Moose trotted out of the way, the bulls still wearing the heavy antlers that would be shed before too long. Quickly the time passed, and the cabin loomed ahead on the ridge. Johnny never sang in the wilds, but his spirits were high and he felt like it now. But that was before he came to the top of the ridge and saw the devastation. The cabin was gutted by fire. The heavy logs that made the walls still stood, but the inside and part of the roof were nothing but a charred ruin. The little cabin was just a shell. Johnny could scarcely believe his eyes. The fact that there was no smoke and few smoldering embers indicated that this must have happened on the first night he was absent. How had it started? Johnny pulled open the weakened door and stood on the threshold looking around, trying to remember any act of carelessness that might be possible. The fire in the stove had died down before he left. There was no loose matches that the wood mice could gnaw. The chimney had been perfectly insulated. He gave it up. Presently he thought of the Indians. Could they have come for his provisions and burned the place to hide the evidence of their pillage? No, they were good chaps and friendly. He could trust them. Somehow, he decided, it must have been his own fault. Perhaps one of his oily rags had ignited from spontaneous combustion, or a cigarette butt had burned the table. He felt very low. At this point he happened to glance at Reddy. The hair on the hound's shoulders bristled, and he was walking stiff-legged as he always did when irritated or angry. No wonder, thought Johnny. Even the dog was riled by this desolation. Reddy, however, kept his nose to the ground. He was not looking at the cabin. He was trailing. Johnny, suddenly aroused by a new idea, hurried to him. The hound worked slowly around the cabin and then back again. After that, he made a wide circle, and a still wider one. The scent was elusive, very stale. He could make nothing of it, so he returned to the cabin. There he resumed his careful, thorough study of the ground, trying to find a trail that he could follow. He covered every inch as he worked up and down the various paths. Johnny gave up hope about his idea and went inside the cabin to examine the damage, but the hound still continued to sniff. The ranger was bending over the remains of what had been a crude chest of drawers containing his clothes when the air was electrified by the baying of the hound. Reddy had found the trail. The red hound was on a boulder behind the cabin, and from that boulder he jumped to another. More sniffing, and then another beautiful long note. Small wonder there'd been no tracks, or any other sign in the paths. Whoever, or whatever, had done the mischief had come and gone by, treading only on the high rocks, which would show nothing and carry almost no scent. The fact that the stone was wet at the time accounted for the slight trace that the hound was able to catch now. Wonderful Reddy! Johnny's heart beat fast as he saw the hound doing almost the impossible. It was slow work, but Reddy persisted. From stone to stone, further and further down the ridge. At length he reached the shady damp places under the trees, and there found much more scent. His voice rang out repeatedly. Johnny followed, first to the creek, and then to the slope on the other side. Here there was the first real evidence that Johnny sought, the remains of a camp. There were tracks of horses indicating that the man, or men, had mounted here and ridden away. For a time Reddy was confused and could only circle. Presently, however, he realized that his quandary had left the ground, and that it was the horses he should follow from this point. He started so eagerly that Johnny could scarcely stay with him in the scramble up the slope, and over the next ridge, then down on the other side, and all the way to the Athabasca River. There was another deserted camp, evidently used during the last night, for the tracks were still fresh and the fire ashes not yet scattered. What intrigued the ranger was the empty tin can, on which was the date of purchase in his own writing. He pocketed it as Exhibit A against his enemies. There was very little ice on the river, but the water was wide and deep and not inviting. Nevertheless, where the tracks indicated that the horses had crossed, Johnny waded in too, determined to see the hunt to a finish. The chilling current nearly swept him off his feet, and it carried the swimming hound quite a distance down the stream, so when they arrived on the far bank, both of them looked like half-drowned rats. Reddy shook much of the water out of his coat, but Johnny did not want to spare the time to build a fire and dry his clothes. He simply poured the water out of his shoes. The tracks were fresh, and he decided to follow where the light was good. It was evident that the riders were hurrying. Wherever there was good ground in the well-worn trail leading south, the horses had been made to trot. There was no sign that they'd been allowed any time to nip at the bunches of grass along the way. Where the tracks were soft in the ground, Johnny easily counted that there were 4 horses, possibly 2 for riders and 2 for pack, and again his original idea took possession of him, and he felt more sure than ever that Bill and Mose were the men ahead of him. At times he and Reddy ran. The hound was silent now, his hair bristling all down his spine as the scent increased. 3 miles of good going, and no glimpse of the riders. More miles, and still no view of them. The sun was scarcely half an hour above the horizon. Then it was that Reddy left Johnny and started ahead at a full run. Johnny, almost breathless, knew that there was no use in trying to stop him, so he plodded along the well-worn trail as before. Minutes passed, and then there was a furious baying far ahead. A shot rang out, followed by 2 more. A lump rose in Johnny's throat as he sprinted like a runner on his last lap in the race. He ran panting through a thicket of spruce, over an area of windfalls, and out on an open muskeg. Here a strange sight met his eyes. 2 heavily laden horses, were floundering up to their middles in the muskeg's watery slime, and in the narrow ribbon of a path along the edge, Reddy stood over a black blotch which did not move. Johnny, unable to utter a word, staggered forward. The blotch turned out to be a man sprawled on his back. His unwinking eyes gazed up at the hound, who stood on his chest and growled. Growled that growl that only he and the king of the wolves knew how to growl. "Reddy, Reddy!" gasped Johnny, but the man wasn't dead. He was only half scared to death, as a coward always is when things go against him. True, death was looking him in the face at that moment. Death, if he tried to fight, and he knew it. What a revenge! Reddy, whom this man had trapped and wanted to kill, holding him helpless in the mud, until the man he had tried to ruin could come. The hound's growling ceased when Johnny arrived, but he had to be lifted aside and held away. "Why'd you do it, Bill?" Johnny managed to ask, but the man said nothing. He just stared at Reddy, straining to free himself. "He's a devil," whispered Bill hoarsely. With one hand, Johnny felt the man's pockets to be sure that he was not armed. "Get up," he commanded. He knew that he was more than a match for the man if he carried no weapons. Very slowly, Bill straightened to a sitting position. "Where's Mose?" asked Johnny. "Gone on," was the husky answer. "The red devil attacked the horses, stampeded them, ran like a fiend, and got me by the foot." But all that Johnny noted was the unguarded admission that Mose was the other man. "Where's the gun that I heard fired?" he demanded. "Mose," Bill began, and then for the first time realized that he was giving his partner away, and he shut up like a clam. "You've already told enough, Bill," Johnny said with a grim smile. "Now get up and help me unload these packs from these horses. We're going to get them out of that bog and ride down to town for a little talk with your old friend the sheriff." "You holding that brute?" "Yes. You needn't be so afraid of him unless you try to run or something foolish." Slowly Bill got to his feet, then stooped quickly and picked up a thick stick that he saw near the trail, just the right size for a formidable club. The hound growled ominously. "Drop that, Bill!" shouted Johnny. The man took one good look in his direction and obeyed. "Now you get to work on those packs." When Johnny was satisfied that Reddy had given the conduct of things over him and would not attack again, he joined Bill in relieving the horses of their heavy burdens. Once free of these, both animals began to plunge wildly, trying to reach firm ground. Mud, water, and slivers of ice flew in every direction. But the efforts, though violent, were not enough. The discouraged horses sank back and lost their remaining ambition. Nothing could stir them. Johnny, now almost as muddy as they were, walked around them on tussocks and tried to solve the problem. Reddy was floundering at his heels, and the ranger noticed that the horses pricked their ears and looked almost panicky whenever he came close. One, a gray, was several yards nearer to the trail than the other, and on him Johnny tried an experiment. He suddenly leapt at the horse, brandishing his arms and yelling. This had no particular effect on the gray, but it made Reddy instantly come to his assistance, and that had effect, for the hound dashed at the horse as if he were going to eat him alive, at the same time giving one of his terrible wolfish roars. The gray snorted and plunged in terror. He threw mud 20 feet and fairly plowed his way to the firm trail, where he heaved himself out of the mire and stood trembling in every limb. "Go get his head," shouted Johnny to Bill. But he couldn't see the man at first, for the simple reason that Bill had run to a tree. Johnny let him stay there and got ready to frighten the second horse into making the necessary effort. The work was rather grim, but it had its comical side. The ranger stooped to scoop some of the mud from the gray and vaulted to his back. Bill reluctantly came down from his retreat and with difficulty got one leg over the other horse and pulled himself into place with the aid of a mane. He felt and looked very shaky without a saddle. "Let's get going," called Johnny, and started off in the growing darkness. He wasn't afraid of losing Bill, for it was evident that without a saddle or bridle, Bill could not manage his horse. The man would be too afraid of being left alone to allow the gray out of sight. Nor was Johnny worrying about any ambush by Mose now that Reddy, good, faithful, and wise Reddy, was ranging ahead. "Get along, old fellow," he said to the gray, pulling at the halter and pressing his heels expertly against the animal's sides, until he made it trot. Out of the tail of his eye he could see Bill clutching the mane and bouncing up and down on the bony horse like a rubber ball. Often he said "get along" to the gray, and often he looked back happily from the tail of his eye to watch Trapper Bill bounce along during that long ride to town in the moonlight. End of chapter 9.